So without further ado, welcome everybody, particularly the audience that have turned up today on a Wednesday evening, 6 o'clock. We know everybody's really busy, but actually that you prioritize time to attend this discussion. And the discussion, as you know, which is the very reason why you've attended, is to feed into the consultation about how do we improve London's police scrutiny and accountability with a particular focus from the Black perspective. We know that the Mayor's action plan has a key commitment to deliver an overhaul of community engagement and scrutiny structures to ensure that London's diverse communities are better represented. And so today I really welcome the focus that we've got in terms of policing and health, and my comrades and colleagues here today. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves, and at the same time, I'm going to ask them to answer this question. How can we make sure community-led police accountability includes the right people and is representative of all Londoners, and from that lens really incorporates the Black Londoners' experience of policing? May I start with Marie?
Good evening, and thanks for inviting me, Jacqui. So my name is Marie Gabriel, and I'm chair of the Race and Health Observatory, which is an independent body established to examine and to close the gap on health inequalities experienced by Black and minority ethnic communities in England. So we're independent. We work as a proactive investigator. We uncover new evidence and insight, and we provide practical evidence-based recommendations and to bring about change and improvement and that closing of the gap. And we also facilitate the long-term transformation and improvement across health and care. So we're not only just data-driven and gathering evidence, we're actually solution-focused. So I'm really pleased to be here. I do have another job where I'm the chair of an integrated care system, which is a relatively new way of organising the NHS. And my system is in North East London, which actually has 53% Black and minority ethnic population. So we don't talk about minority in our patch, we talk about majority. But a lot of our work is about closing the gap on health inequalities there in the integrated care system. But I'm here with my Race and Health Observatory hat on. And you asked a question about how can we make sure community-led policing accountability really involves Black people and actually all the people that we need from our communities to be represented. And I think it's quite interesting because I'm going to throw the question up a bit in the air, because I think the structures that we have at the moment are about representation, about advising, about scrutiny, but that is about influence rather than securing change. So, but we'll probably come on to that later. But I think in terms of the representation piece, it's very difficult for a group of individuals now, no matter how diverse that group is, to represent all the communities that make up the Black communities of London. So I think that any structure underpinning representation has got to be resourced to enable those individuals to have a direct dialogue by the communities that are actually impacted by the police. So young people, people with mental health issues, and so that they can inform the contributions that their representatives make at that fora, as well as ensuring that they are part of that representation and ensuring that's not the only way that we have dialogue. So there's more than the independent advisory groups, there's more than MOPAC. It has to be an ongoing, deep and meaningful conversation that we have. I'll stop there. Thanks, Jacqui.
Thank you so much, and what a rich start. David.
Yeah, so I'm Dave Nita. Thank you so much, Jacqui, for inviting me to be a part of this forum. Trained as a lawyer, but I'm also a poet and a lecturer, speaker, campaigner generally. And I'm very much interested in this work that you're doing, and because it is so important. It's one of the main things that affects our community, and it's one of the main things that stifles and kills the talent in our community. Not just people, but the talent and the great resource to the society that we could be if we didn't have the issues that we're dealing with here, police brutality and the rest of it. Let me just come quickly to the point of who should make up these bodies that are challenging these systems. You could have many stakeholders, but I'm just gonna focus on two. There are many more. This is not exhaustive. It's just two. The first group, I would say, I think the most important issue in this discussion right now is acknowledgement and admission on the part of the police. I mean, if we can just get a clear statement and acknowledgement that the police is racist. We've never really had that. We've had judges pronouncing the Metropolitan Police institutionally racist. When the Black community, we know it. But it's another thing when the abuser admits it. You can have a huge cathartic power that comes from that, from admission, when somebody admit it and acknowledge it. So I think the first component of this would be police officers themselves, Black and white, male and female, who are prepared to admit this racism in the force and whistleblow and bring out examples and so on. We had a raft of these exposures in the paper today when a WhatsApp group was discovered. You may have read about it, where it went beyond racism. It went to well, anti-Semitism was a form of that was being talked about. Sexism, ableism, all of this was uncovered in the WhatsApp. It was the disgusting text that was being sent around, right? Okay, that's a discovery and an investigation. That's one thing, but it's different when there's an admission. The power of an admission would be huge, of police coming forward and say, I'm going to tell you what I experienced. I'm going to tell you about the racism I experienced in the force. So that would be one group, which I think would be very powerful. I think without that group, without that element of the group will be severely hampered. Because if you don't have admission, you're talking in a vacuum. If you don't have the main abuser admitting it, because remember, the abuser will remain in power, Even, I tell you what is even more powerful. Even if the abuser admit it and say, we are not going to change or we are unable to change, it's still more powerful than the denial, because the denial is an insult. The denial is a gaslighting, and that is hugely damaging to our mental health. And then the other group I would include is youngsters, Black youngsters of all genders, male and female Black youngsters, I think would be important because they get the brunt. They start to get policing from schools. Policing don't start with the uniformed police. It starts with the school structures that police Black youths differently. And I think we can learn something from Black students who start to feel this kind of policing and hostile treatment from the school system, from the racist structure in the school system, and that eventually goes on to the police. But I think that voice is also important. There are many more, but I'll just say those two for now.
It's interesting that you mention the impact on our mental health, and this focus here is around our health and well-being and the relationship in terms of the interaction with policing in relation to our health across the life course. And very interesting that actually we can think about the children and young people's experience in terms of adultification, that racialized experience and the impact that has on our mental health outcomes and emotional health and well-being, and the ricochet of that throughout the whole of our communities. So I'm really, I think that what you've identified, Marie and David, is like there are key cohorts that we need to surface here that need to be really quite rigorously involved in holding the police to account and helping to support the effective scrutiny from a position of expertise, what that racialized lived experience from those dimensions actually enable. So with that in mind, and Marie, you did even speak to, and I want to also emphasize the point that you've made actually, David, which is about accountability and admission, which I think is a real key kind of point. And to some extent, the mayor's action plan is trying to go down that road, but perhaps we need an even more clearer statement of admission from the police around this particular point, because without that, actually, we're in a position of gaslighting, as you said, and so that's a really good point. But I wanted to pick up in my next question, Marie, your point about actually, do the structures that we currently have, do the mechanisms that we currently have, do the bodies that we currently have that are about accountability and scrutiny actually fit the purpose? Or do we have an opportunity to tap into the Black fantastical imagination and identify, if you had a blank page to design community-led police accountability in London, what might that look like? And which powers or areas of police practice should we attend to and that communities be involved in scrutinizing? You've kind of named one or two, but I'd like us to elaborate more and think about the how we might do this in maybe a different way than what is currently taking place, because currently we're not included. So actually maybe the ways that are currently pursued, we can't even tweak around the edges. What we might need to do is go to that blank script paper and say, you know what, our imagination, the Black fantastical imagination, how might we reimagine what this looks like? Marie.
Okay, I just wanted to say something to you, because we mentioned mental health, and we know that 40% of Black people enter mental health services through police or criminal justice, and 4 more times more likely to be forcibly detained. But David R. Williams is a professor on the board at the Race and Health Observatory. He's the professor of public health and chair of Harvard School of Public Health. But he and his colleagues have done some work, and what they've discovered is the impact in America of Black people being killed by the police. And he talks about the days of pain and the poor mental health that affect all the community afterwards. And over the year, it's about the same as the days of pain that some people have who have diabetes. So although we think about the particular person or their family, their nearest is, actually it causes our whole community to have poor mental health. So I just wanted to point that out.
Yes, the domino effect.
Domino effect, definitely, and affects all our well-being.
Yes.
So I think I would really want to rip it up a bit and start again, because it is very representative in nature. Not that representation doesn't have its place in terms of that overview and scrutiny, but actually I'm much more interested in actually giving our people the levers to create change and to be involved in setting the policy and the priorities and the measures by which the police would be judged. I'm thinking, ideally we could be asking in those fora that we should commission investigations. We should be involved in, into incidents or concerns that we might have from the data, that open data that we see, analysis that we see. We should be the ones who could perhaps be looking at co-designing the police complaint procedures and actually looking at the outcomes of those, or even being the investigators of those complaints alongside. And I think that goes wider than what we have in London. It's thinking about things like, I always get the title wrong, but Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary and Fire, whatever it is, service. But, so they have a commitment to race equality within their inspections. Actually, who's doing those inspections? So I think I'd like to move more to what you have been leading on in terms of the PCREF. So yes, that's a patient carer race equality framework that you have in the mental health services. What would that look like within the Metropolitan Police? What if our communities co-designed that?
I know, it'd be brilliant.
Okay, I'll stop because I've only got 20 minutes.
Yeah, I keep that keeps the wandering around my mind. It's like, what might that kind of rigorous race equity accountability framework look like in this context? Because in truth, Marie, it can be applied to any area. It's just in the first instance, we're talking about mental health, but actually what we're talking about is where you are involving citizens. It's a participatory approach to driving race equity. We're all doing it together. So actually, you're quite right, and we might need to bring that to the table and look at what does that look like in this context. So thank you for that, David.
Yes, I think Marie is absolutely right. I mean, you would really have to demolish the system as it exists today, as we find it. If you consider the recent Guardian report, I think it just came out yesterday, findings of 7 times as likely, Black people, 7 times
the inquest report, yeah.
The inquest report.
Yeah.
Thank you for that, Jacqui. Yeah. Things are getting worse. This is biblical, you know. This reminds you of readings you used to read when they used to say, well, you know, somebody demon possessed and whatever, your demon leave, come back 7 times stronger, right? Things are getting worse. It's worse. Why? Because you don't kill the demon. You just drive it out. So every now and then in our society, guess what happened? We have a brutal police act. And we deal with racism and we say we drive it out. But it come back. And it don't just come back like it was before. It come back stronger. That's just the nature of racism. It survives. Racism, almost like it's one of the most formidable forces in the history of our humanity. It survives, it gets better, it hones its skills, it becomes more sophisticated, right? It does more damage. Each successive generation does more damage. So you would really have to demolish the system. And when you consider that the police force, and many of us know that the police force was started to protect the sugar money, enslavement, you know. Canary Wharf, you can go and see it there, that warehouse that's there now called Sugar and Slave Museum was the largest building in Europe. Used to store the ill-gotten gains from enslavement. And the police was formed for that, to protect it. And if you talk to any police officer right now in the Westminster area and ask them what is their job is to protect the listed buildings in the area. They'll just tell you the priority of the police. But if you talk about a blank slate and talk about if you want to set up a police force, what would it be for? All of us would agree that it should be to detect violent acts and stamp them out. You know, that's what it would be. But if you want to find violent acts, you can find it in the police force itself. Look at what's coming on with all the rape and the covering up and the photograph and all these things that they're doing. You can find it there. So essentially what we're left with a very, to say it's an imperfect system is a compliment. And whatever we do without this acknowledgement that I talked about earlier, whatever we do without it is tinkering around the edges. It's not really doing much. It's really like those, I guess, shooing away that like a demon, dealing with it, and then not doubling down. Because what has to happen? You cannot have an era where you're not dealing with racism, where you think, okay, we've done it and we've done some massive changes, everything is all right. No, you have to have monitoring organizations, as we were saying before, that actually police the police. Because you heard the phrase, power corrupts absolutely, and the police is corrupt, and it don't take, let's say, one bad apple, but it rots the whole system. The whole system gets rotten. And what tends to happen, coming back to this whole metaphor around the demon, is this. You say, all right, let's ignore racism because it just affects Black people. Let's ignore how police treat race, the issue of race. It creeps, they say, okay, it's all right, we can treat Black people like that. No, nobody said so we can treat women like this. We can treat the disabled like this. We can treat people with mental illness like this. So it grows. Martin Luther King said it himself. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So you can have to have a zero tolerance approach. And the biggest issue to confront, I believe, and everything springs from this, is racism. Racism is rooted in white supremacy, which makes it okay. It just don't make it okay for the police, you know. It makes it okay for everybody. I remember the Central Park incident when the black man was within his rights to tell the lady that you need to have the dog on it because that was an era where you can't have your dog off the leash. Same day George Floyd was killed. Same day that happened. I mean, people forget about that one. But she said, I'm going to call the police and tell him that an African-American is not. So she understands the power of race. She understands her power as a white person, weaponizing that. Everybody understands it. Even the black police officers who killed Tyree Nichols, they understand it. Nothing is going to come up. This is a black man, right? So race is essentially a part of racism is a part of until that becomes the main issue, and that there's a governmental level acknowledgement of it and a tackling of it and a deconstruction of it. Not just deconstruction, there's no end date to deconstruction of a system. It has to be a continuous system.
It's ongoing. It's absolutely ongoing. Yes, indeed. And so that's really kind of clear in terms of what we are dealing with here is deeply embedded structural racism, deeply embedded systematic racism, you know, at every level. And actually, I would even go as far to say as actually, really, we need to be clear that we're talking about, in this context, anti-black racism.
Yes.
And it's a particular nature and form that we are dealing with that other communities, other racialized communities do not experience. And that's what we're contending with when we are saying, actually, in terms of holding, so we know that the police is in this kind of state of, like, you know, it's in a transitional stage, hopefully moving on a road to improvement, because every aspect of it has been proved to be really quite disgraceful, fundamentally disgraceful today, and that it's not operating as a force to protect or keep us safe. But moving down that road, and in order to support it to go down that road from a black perspective, we're saying here, what can we imagine that would help to hold the police accountable and scrutinize them in order to be really accountable, and actually to help them in terms of that improvement agenda, which is precisely what the patient and carer race equality framework is about. It's about a framework to support that improvement by providing the checks and balances from those that are experiencing the impact of poor services, to give that feedback for the system to change much more rapidly. So if we imagine what might those, what kind of ways might we design a community-led police accountability function for Londoners? What do you think, in a nutshell, what might that be, David?
I think one of the things you'd have to do is to establish an ethos around the response to racism, right? And it would have to be agreed on a community level and on every level. That one of the things I think would be helpful to agree about racism, that it will not, let me go backward. It won't carry a death sentence.
No, we're looking for real brisk response here now.
No, but
time is of the essence.
It's so critical that it.
So let's get really precise here, because we've got to move on.
All right. Let me see if I can do it as sharp as possible. One of the things that we need to do is to encourage an ethos where if police officers find that they're racist, it should not be a big surprise. That's the first thing. It's so important, because to get to the solution, you have to get to the point where you recognize that when you discover racism in you, as you will, it doesn't carry a death sentence. It shouldn't be a big surprise. And there is treatment for you. So one of the things we need to do, is many things, but quick one, find a treatment for racism, because you're going to find that it is right, that it's inevitable.
Okay, good, right. Okay, so we've got that. Thank you very much for that. And so if we had and thinking back to how we can hold as a Black community the police accountable and how we can scrutinize them, how might we think about those groups operating? You know, how might that function operate, or how might that be structured? Is that at a local neighborhood level? Is that community level? Is that, I mean, where does that and how does that happen? Marie, could you help us to explore that one, please? You're on silent.
Sorry. So I think it has to happen at each of those levels. Yes. So it has to happen at that community level. And I would say even deeper than, you know, even more community than the borough level, because I know we have the independent advisory groups, which I just said they've got to be radically changed. But, you know, because each community will have different challenges, you know, and each community in terms of their diversity will be different, you know. So I think about, and even areas where I live in Newham, that communities gather in different places and they have different experiences with the police as Black people. So I think it has to be there, it has to be at borough, it has to be at London wide. And what's really important, I think, is the way in which those groups interact with each other, how they share knowledge, how they share best practice, how they come together as a strong voice and agree common themes and common areas for, as I was talking earlier about investigations, for you know, or looking at complaints across the piece. So I think it's actually at different levels. I just want to go back on something that Dave said, because the police do know they're racist. I mean, is it Baroness Casey? That, you know, racist, misogynist. The National Police Chief, whatever it's called, sorry, they have a race action plan, and they list everywhere where they, you know, it disproportionately impact on Black people. So they know it, and I suppose in the Caribbean way, they don't feel it. So they know it, but they don't feel it. It's our communities that feel it and know it and find the solutions.
Which is why it's so critical that our additional level of scrutiny and holding accountability through the investigations, as you articulate, looking at complaints, looking at the data, is that feedback and lens to really hold them accountable about what they know is their bad behavior in this regard, right? So when you look at, for example, that the inquest report says that Black people are 7 times more likely to die than their white counterparts when restrained by police. When we look at it from a health perspective, we're talking about Olaseni Lewis, we're talking about Sean Rigg, we're talking about Rocky Bennett, we're talking about so many different Black bodies that have had this racialized experience of policing that has led to their death. So actually, when we're talking about holding the police accountable and scrutinizing them for the disproportionate levels of stop and search, because you're seeing Black bodies, for the adultification and therefore different treatment of our children and young people, for the heavy-handed sort of levels of surveillance that our Black bodies are experiencing, because that is the nature and symptomatic of anti-Black racism. What is it that we need to do in terms of elevating our role in making sure that we're holding them accountable and scrutinizing them? This is the thing that we are looking to co-create amongst ourselves, actually, as a series of recommendations about how we want to see it going forward, because we can describe exactly, all of us know that really the detail of how bad it is. What we need to get into is what is the imagination based on that detail of how terrible our lived experience is. How are we going to make it better through playing a proactive role in scrutinizing and holding them accountable? And how can we do it in a way that we are supported to fulfill that role? Rather than it being something that is, we're doing it and it's another weight on ourselves. In fact, it's another symptom of racism. We're now having to repair their damage, and we're not even being resourced for that. How can that be? And people are talking about that on a previous sort of session, is that actually there needs to be some investment in this function. right?
Absolutely, absolutely. We have to be funded for our expertise. So when I talk about, leading complaint reviews, or actually supporting the responses to complaints, or how families are responded to when they've, when they've had an incident that impacts on their family, actually we are experts, and that has to be funded, actually. And yeah, I'll stop now. Sorry.
No, that's really, really helpful. That really is helpful, because that taps into then being resourced to be able to work with each other across London, these groups, because that's what you're talking about, being resourced to then work with the police and the Mayor of London around this. And actually, there's an indication about perhaps what might it be that MORPAC might MORPAC be able to support this function in terms of resources or funding and training? What might people think in that regard? We've just got a couple of minutes, because I know I want to pick up some questions from the
police
audience.
should fund it. MOPAC shouldn't. The police should fund it.
So the police should fund it. Thank you very much, David. So that's funding.
Yeah,
David?
I think this question of expertise is right, and one of the expertise that should be developed, and I keep coming back to the point because I think it's so important, is the whole idea of ridding somebody of this whole business of racism. And I think a model is what we see in alcohol. We have the AA. You see them meeting in churches, they have groups, they have hall, community center, and people who admit having a problem, they go there and they go through a step process, and they try to get treatment from alcoholism. And so once an alcoholic, always an alcoholic. I think racism is the same. And I think one of the expertise that, because the systems we're talking about, where we monitor the police and we do this and we set up groups and they have to account and so on, I find a lot of that, you're just being managed. The police just learn a different language, they know how to behave, they stop saying this word, they continue to be that. Actually, real change comes when when anybody in the system accepts that they've got a problem. So if you look, for example, at the young girls who had that issue when she was being searched, right, in the school, it's one seamless, continuous policing that started with the teachers and ended with police officers, right, in that situation. Yes. It's a whole system, and it's right. A racist system, because you cannot imagine that happening to a white girl. It would never happen to a black girl. And the only thing that causes that is anti-black racism that causes that. Now, until people are, number one, submit themselves to be treated or identified as having an issue with racism and referred for mental health treatment, and that's one of, not the only one, but that's one of the expertise we need to have within the Black community, so that if we get to that point, it's not the white community trying to develop organizations based on dealing with racism at the deepest levels and trying to deconstruct that with people. So that's
Thank you so much. The perspectives here are really great and multi-dimensional and really helpful to support our thinking outside of the box, as they would like to say. I might just want to close on this final question before I ask the audience for their questions. And if we could respond just really briskly, how would we know if what we were co-creating, and that we were overhauling this way, that community-led engagement and scrutiny, how would we know if it's working? Just a couple of points, and then we can move to questions from the floor. Georgie, have you got some questions ready to go?
Yep, there's like one or two, but if you are in the audience, this is a good time to start adding those questions in. So
yes, please. Okay, so how would we know if it was working? If our scrutiny and our holding the system to account and our interventions through what we were imagining was actually working, how would we know?
So I think there's a couple of ways. I think, those hard figures that we know about disproportionality. So those things about stop and search, and it's everything. It's like, so there's stuff on that police chief's report that talked about more likely to be compliant, handcuffed, 3 more times more likely to have that spit and bite thing shoved into your mouth. So I think it's those areas, the gap should be closing. I think that's for true. I think the other thing has to be qualitative. So we do not, the Black community do not trust the police. You know, how can you? How can we? So I think it's about a way of finding out whether or not that trust is increasing. And I know that in the mayoral strategy there's a real push to have more Black officers. I'm concerned about that, because is that safe? And if you think about what just happened in America, where you've got 5 Black officers who are now, you know, being charged with murder or manslaughter or whatever it is. So actually, I think there has to be some safety and some work done before that can happen.
Yes.
I think then that's a next set of figures, I think.
Okay,
I hand over to Dave now.
Yeah,
so actually that whole measure around trust is something that I think that we need to work on. So I'm glad you've tuned into that. David.
Yeah, you know, just something like a census, but not every 10 years, probably an annual census that takes the measurement. You'd have to be talking to young people and their experiences on the streets. The figures that are already promulgated around Stop and Search, you can look at those figures. But yeah, you'd want to do something that is continuous and routine, so that you can see, you know, what's the progress. Things are getting better, things are getting worse. And always, you know, it's a bit like Ofsted of the police, you know. You have to keep the whole thing in check, understanding that it's a system that's designed in the way it's designed, and it's designed only to get worse if it's not checked. It has to be checked, has to be monitored.
Ofsted of the police from a Black perspective, Black-led Ofsted of the police.
Yeah,
okay, similar to that. So okay, so that's really quite interesting. We've got a few great ideas coming forward. I wonder if we could go to questions from the floor.
Yep. Okay. So I've got the questions up, and let me have a look. So someone asked, how do we as a group of people encourage our young people to become involved and get around the table to work on solutions? So David, that was one of your core, like, necessary people involved. How do you motivate young people to do this?
I do this when I work in schools. One of the things that I've started to do recently is to get young people to illustrate through drawings and illustration, graphic illustrations, you know, and it's surprising what they produce. So I think, you know, we've got a lot of reports. We've got a recent one from Inquest. We've got the David Lamb report on all these reports. And they're written in a particular style, and they're written really to hold up the corner of a desk. They say the same things, because the same thing, nothing really changes, right? You can write the one 2 years from now, we know. You just write things, just write it a little bit worse, and you can publish it then. But you write it in advance, because this is how it's going. Young people, get young people to write a report of their experience, because the true measure of what's really going on. Once you kind of adult and beyond 25, you know, you get less and less interaction with the police, especially if you know how to avoid them. And especially, you know, to kind of talk to them, have a conversation, whatever. But the real brunt of the racism is being felt by young people. So what we really want to do is commission a report from young people and empower young people to write their report, write their findings, write their recommendations. I think this should be routinely done, because it's surprising. I remember, say, years gone by, you know, Tutankhamun, who ran Nubia, Egypt, you know, we see this great mask and so on, but behind it was a 14-year-old boy running a nation, right? This is not unusual. And so our young princes and princesses should be allowed that opportunity to articulate their views, reduce it to a report, fill it with a lot of graphic illustrations. Graphic illustrations are going to become increasingly important, because they tell a powerful story, and then we kind of absorb these reports and the recommendation and take them on comprehensively.
I think that's right. And what we've been doing as part of this consultation is really harnessing the voice and the contribution of our young people to assist with the process of this consultation, because essentially what we're finding the same thing, that the most impacted are actually our young people. And you can see that really starkly through the figures around stop and search happening at very, very, very young ages in terms of the racialized Black body. Marie, I can't see you on the screen. I don't know if you wanted to respond to that. Yes, I can see you.
I didn't know if you could see me. I think so. I think the truth is, it's people who they trust that have to engage with them. And so when we're thinking about those groups that need to be resourced to be part of the conversation, those people that work with young people, like Dave going into schools, there's obviously, and because he feels it, knows it, there's a bond of trust there. So I think that's how we engage. We engage where those young people are and on their terms, and actually we should fund or reward them in some way for that engagement.
Thank you so much. Georgie.
Well, there we go. The next question is about mental health. And someone asked, is it really safe to think about racism as a mental health problem? Can you consider the immediate, mid, and longer unintended consequences of taking an approach where racism is a mental health problem?
So I'm quite aware of racism being perceived as a public health crisis, yes.
Yeah,
but
I think it's
different
from
it being perceived as a mental health problem. David, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, because I raised it, so it's a good challenge. It's a good challenge, and it might not be the best way to describe it. I do know that the DSM model used to have a lot of definitions of things that were mental health problems, right? And one of them was the condition of trying to free yourself from enslavement. I'm glad I can't even remember the name of what.
Drapetomania.
Well, yeah, thank you, Jacqui, but I'm glad I don't even want to remember it because it's such a nonsense, the phrase,
it's
right?
Nonsense.
So all of these things can go in the book. And I'm just postulating from my armchair that when you behave in a particular way that is deleterious to a particular community and will lead to the destruction of civilization, if you continue on that path, unchecked, unstopped, then it's the actions of a mania. It's a form of a mania. But I'm not an expert. I'm just an observer. And I think when I think of somebody behaving like that, they need some form of treatment ranging from pulling aside and having a talk to a sectioning, meaning you're protecting that person from themselves and the rest of society, which is what this sectioning is used to do to people in community who they say have a mental health problem, because what you're doing is damaging to yourself and damaging to the rest of the community. So the question, I might have a point, is it useful to describe it like that? I know I will also say it's evil, but some people don't like these religious models. Terms like evil, good and evil, and so on. But I mean, as somebody with a religious background, I would also describe it as evil, demonic. But I think I probably might be able to get away with mental health in our society because it is something that it must be a degradation and diminishment of the mind and a fantasy. Because white supremacy is based on a fantasy. It's almost like one of the mental health conditions we talk about in mental health is delusions of grandeur. When you think you're something you're really not. To think of white supremacy is a delusion, really. And so if that is a form of mental health, then racism that emanates from it surely is in the ballpark somewhere. But don't quote me. Don't quote me. Let's just discuss it.
Yeah. And this is a discussion indeed. Marie.
So I think, is it safe? I just think we have to be, I think in the way that Dave said it, yes, I completely understand what he's saying. You know, it's a myth, it's not true. And if you believe in it, what's wrong with you? But also we know that the experience that we have at the hands of the police and the criminal justice system and all sorts of other things makes us have poor mental health. And it's quite interesting, though. We do need to talk about that, and we do need to recognise that, and we need to be safe talking about that. So the Race and Health Observatory had this conference last year in July, an international conference, and there were people there who were First Nation from, I think it was from Canada, and they were talking about the high rates of suicide amongst young people. You know, I don't want to trigger anybody, but, you know, they were talking about that. But what they were talking about, that they had some of the highest rates in the country for First Nation or Indigenous communities. But actually, where those communities were actively involved in challenging government, in challenging, you know, the powers that be, that rate was amongst some of the lowest. So acknowledging the challenges we have and acting to do something about it, creating that change is good for our mental well-being.
It's good for our mental health, of course, which is why we're here today, being activists in a sense and looking at ways that we can be active in order to challenge and change the way that things operate, which are oppressive in policing operating in a very oppressive kind of way. I cannot get away from the fact that black bodies are 7 times more likely to die than their white counterparts when restrained by police. And when we think of Olasena Lewis and Sean Rigg, and we think of when we are at our most vulnerable, the nature and form of policing is one that leads us to death. Is a very, very shocking feature of our lived experience. It's a very scandalous and shocking feature of our lived experience. And so for us, when we're thinking about how do we hold the police accountable and scrutinize them, actually it's also bringing into that equation those experiences of where the police is having interactions with our communities when they are at their most vulnerable in terms of having mental health challenges. And how do we make sure that we're holding the police accountable in those kind of like scenario? And indeed, the question mark about the level of the police involvement in that arena is a question mark that is an ongoing discussion around. In fact, that was something around from the Mental Health Act. I mean, what really is the role of the police in terms of that interaction when somebody is having a mental health crisis is an ongoing question. But in the interim, until that is resolved, what role do we play in holding that level of scrutiny and accountability? And I think that really starts having a real play when you think about, okay, when at that very neighborhood and community level, right, when a neighbor is seeing a police coming in an interaction with a community member who is maybe having an experience of being detained under the Mental Health Act, under a section 135 or a section 136, what is the role of our neighbours and community members in holding the way that is conducted accountable and scrutinising that? Do you see what I'm saying? It's like so that we're actually taking it to that granular level of that lived reality and providing the checks and balances at every level of the system, not just at that abstract level when we're looking at numbers and data, but actually that very lived experience of that your neighbour, your next door neighbour, or your family member. What role in this? Okay, so Georgie, I think that we need to kind of move it on to the next stage of the process, and if we could explain to people how we're going to make that transition, but also really encourage people, if you could put in the chat that whoever's on the call, if you could also complete the online survey as an additional way of contributing to the consultation, we would be most grateful. Nearly 100% of those people who were on the call, the webinar last week, actually completed the survey